Hello, it's Jacob again, and in this one, we'll be talking about corporations and stock markets. Now, normally, when this topic is covered in an economics class, it's presented as business structures. But frankly, corporations are the only interesting business structure. The only real reason anybody talks about business structures is just to contrast corporations against other types. I also want to let you know before we get into it that for some of you, you are going to know every single thing I have to say. I figure that in any given section of mine, there's probably at least one guy who invests in stock markets, who day trades as a hobby. Well, if you're that guy, I have nothing new to teach you today. And even if you're not, you might already be familiar with all of this. But the reason why I teach it is that while there are many people who are already very familiar with how corporations work, there are also many people who don't know anything about how they work. And so this lecture is for you. I'd encourage all of you to watch it just in case I happen to bring something up. But, if you're looking at the homework, then you can kind of judge for yourself. So let's start off. Your most basic business structure is what's called a sole proprietorship, where a person owns and acts as the legal face of the business. And they may be self employed or they may hire workers. But in either case, the business is an extension of the owner's identity. When the owner buys things, borrows money, loans money as it may be, when they hire workers, all of this they do in their own name. They might have a name that they put on the business, they might have a sign up, but it's all being done as an extension of the self. Any name that they attach to it is really just advertising. And because of this, the owner has unlimited liability for his or her actions. If the owner were to have some accident on their property, like someone slipped on the floor of their restaurant, broke a hip, and sued them, the owner would be responsible for it to the full extent of the damages. If the owner were to get themselves deeply in debt and go bankrupt, they would have full responsibility for the entire debt. Likewise, they'd have full responsibility for the payroll. They'd have full responsibility for any violation of any contract, like if they were to fall through on paying for a certain delivery. The business has no separate existence outside of the owner because the business only exists in some abstract sense as a collection of all the owner's individual business transactions. Now, this is a very intuitive way to think about business. And it's good enough for a world of peasants and craftsmen. It's good enough for a world of pioneer farmers. It's good enough for a world of hunter gatherers. For most of humanity's existence, this is how most people lived. Now, again, you can have employees and still be a sole proprietorship. You can have contracts with other people and still be a sole proprietorship. So, for much of history, you do have people working on behalf of others. But the relationship is face to face. The relationship is between people who deal with each other as people. And as you're going to see, that's very important. Now, what's somewhat more complex is what we call a partnership. When two or more legal entities have a contract with each other that goes beyond just a contract. They have such an intimate working relationship that it's not good enough for their needs just to specify certain responsibilities or certain expectations, but instead, for all practical purposes, they have to merge their two businesses into one business. And there are a lot of ways that you can imagine something like this coming about. You might have some sort of production where people have different specialized jobs that they do, yet their jobs are so closely intertwined that for all practical purposes, they have to work together because one cannot sell their product or their service without the work of another. I believe a lot of law firms, for example, many law firms are run as partnerships, and that's part of the reason why. They'll collaborate on a case together. You can get partnerships in things like trade. When you think of merchants back in the day or transportation nowadays, you might have a merchant in one city who does so much business with a merchant in another city that really they're in it together. They don't just happen to buy or sell a few goods from each other on a regular basis. They're doing most of their business with each other. Each one is like a middleman for the other. And so it makes sense for them to merge themselves into one business, to agree that because their fates are so bound up with each other, it makes sense to share the liabilities, to share the responsibilities, even to pool their resources, as long as they have an understanding written down in their contract of what is expected of each other and how they're going to divide up the rewards and the risks of their business. Even something like marriage is very literally a partnership. Oftentimes, when you hear discourse about marriage in public, it often focuses on romantic love or on some kind of religious basis for it. But pretty much every culture invents marriage, whether monogamous or polygamous or taking other forms, because it effectively acts as a sort of family formation contract, which it is able to merge the resources of the family unit into one, to lay down certain expectations, certain rights, and to present a single face to the public that the family can function more efficiently than if it stayed in a state of anarchy. And this is where you start to get contract law evolving. Because cultures invent law like a technology to solve problems. Law is costly. I think I've already introduced this concept in the externalities topic when I talked about coast bargaining. If I didn't talk about it much there, then I'm sure it came up in the homework. But cultures don't generally introduce laws or entire legal concepts unless there's some kind of need for it. And often the need is based on some sort of economic need. And so, as a society grows more and more complex in its production and distribution methods, as its economy becomes less and less comprehensible, and as our exchange becomes more and more impersonal, we would expect the legal forms of that society to become more complex at the same time in order to manage that. When you think of a lot of your great legal systems of the distant past, they revolve around interpersonal exchange. They revolve around contracts and around rights. You could be speaking of the common law of Northern Europe, which originated out of the Germanic cultures, the barbarians, but eventually flourished in England and became the basis for our theory of torts in the modern United States. You could be talking about something like Sharia law in the Muslim world, which goes far beyond just being a moral and religious code, but is this all-encompassing socio-political system that includes doctrines about inheritances, commercial codes, regulations on things like banking. And again, for much of history, It was sufficient to rely on these sort of old-fashioned traditional codes that focused entirely on people, the relationship of real people to one another. But the partnership had certain major weaknesses, and these weaknesses would lead to the development of a uniquely Western concept. Actually, I apologize. I have to take that back. They did have corporations in Asia. I just don't know much about them, and I don't believe they had any impact on the Western corporations. So whenever I say corporation, I do mean the Western form that we're familiar with. But there were weaknesses with the partnership that would lead to an obscure Roman legal concept coming back in great force to totally change the way that we did business well over 1,000 years after Rome fell. Now, the problem is because a partnership is just a contract among individuals, it cannot exist separate from those individuals. If people want in or out, or if, say, they up and die, then the partnership has to be renegotiated. It's a contract among a certain set of people, and you can't just change the set of people, and you can't just change the rules of how it is to operate without consulting everyone. The very nature of a contract is that it has legal force because people voluntarily opted into it. And so there has to be agreement among people in order for the contract to be a contract, in order for it to have legitimacy. The problem is this imposes transaction costs. Every time people want to change the partnership, to change the rules they agreed to, or every time people want to leave or join, they have to negotiate. They have to spend valuable time. And there's no guarantee that everybody is going to get what they want out of it. And this problem is going to get worse the bigger the partnership gets. I'm mostly familiar with how partnerships worked in the Muslim world. I know that might sound a little odd. It just happens that I read a book on why the Muslim world fell behind Europe, and this played a huge role in it. In the Muslim world, you didn't tend to get a partnership beyond 10 people. And even that was rather extreme. Most of the time, a partnership is 2 people, maybe 3 or 4. Certainly, it could be a little bigger if the partnership is mainly kept within the family. But that's the big point. Partnerships were mostly set up between people who were very close friends, who were of one mind already, that there wouldn't be many disputes. And the partnership had to be kept intimately small in order to keep that kind of solidarity. It's an organizational system that simply does not lend itself to being scaled up. And there was another problem with partnerships too. Partnerships become riskier the more people join. See, remember, in the sole proprietorship, the proprietor has unlimited liability. The business is just an extension of their own acts. Even the acts of their employees are ultimately their acts as well. And this is fair and it makes sense. Well, the same is true in a partnership. Now, the partnership might specify some rate at which they distribute responsibility to each other. But the partners really are, at the end of the day, sole proprietors who just happen to have an especially detailed contract with each other. And so, if one partner does something that brings some horrible misfortune down on the partnership, it's going to be felt by both partners. When I say mistakes and misdeeds, this could involve some sort of criminal malfeasance. It could involve bankruptcy, like someone has run the partnership into the ground and run up a huge debt. It could involve a lawsuit. Somebody was reckless and, again, classic man slips on a wet floor, sues them scenario. Now, at a small scale, you have few enough people that if you're a wise businessman, you're going to vet who you do business with. You're going to do business with partners that you can trust. And because the group is small, you can also actively surveil them, right? You can keep track of them and hold them accountable. But as I'm sure you all know from some experience in your lives, the more people you add to a group, the harder it is to control their individual behavior. And so when everyone is on the hook for one individual's behavior, nobody is on the hook for it. And the partnership can end up being very, very dangerous because you run a real risk that somebody else's actions might get you in trouble. And this is going to be a disincentive to form a large partnership. Now, for most of history, the optimal scale of the firm was so small that sole proprietorships and partnerships were worth it. The technology that people used, whether we're talking about agriculture or manufacturing or services, the technology lent itself to very small, very dispersed production, where the family unit was perfectly viable. And even in places where there was some economy of scale, like you would expect on, say, a medieval manor or a slave plantation or a Roman latifundia, which is also a slave plantation. I mean, a lot of your economies of scale early on are directly related to slavery in some form, regimenting large groups of people um, to work some task out in the fields together. Even in that kind of world, the scale is still numbered in the dozens, maybe hundreds of people, but they're mostly employees. And you can still kind of regiment it and create hierarchies within it. But the owner can still fully comprehend and fully finance everything on his own. What changed was technology started to favor production methods which were not as viable for independent entrepreneurs. And it began in the age of exploration. Now, in the past, I've taught a lecture, Secret History of the Corporation, that goes into this in greater detail and gets into some pretty wacky territory with it. Some of the really goofy stuff that's happened in the past around corporations. You're going to get the Cliff's Notes version. The gist of it is that when Europeans began navigating the deep sea, right? For most of history, people don't sail out away from shore. They literally, like a kid in the swimming pool, they cling to the shore. They sail within sight of land because they have no practical way of navigating and their ships suck. But by the age of people like Vasco da Gama or Christopher Columbus, you have new advancements in both navigation and shipbuilding that make it practical for people to sail the deep ocean. And that makes it practical for the first time to create global maritime trade routes. The problem is these trade routes are extremely dangerous and expensive. A galleon is like one of the most expensive and complicated machines to date when they're invented. Nations they care about their ships of the line in the same way that they care about their aircraft carriers today. They're very, very expensive to build, and yet they're so easy to lose because you have shipwrecks. you have massive ocean storms. If you've never been on the open sea, then you might struggle to fully appreciate how awesome the power of nature is. My dad was in the Navy and he'd always talk about it because he was on a destroyer, and that's a fair bit bigger than a Portuguese caravel. But they'd have waves that were taller than the ship itself come crashing over. Now, you imagine being in a small boat like wooden ship propelled by sails, fabric. These things could just get smashed up by the waves. And you're also operating in an environment that is completely plagued with pirates. Both privateers working on behalf of rival governments trying to undermine their imperial, rivals, and also buccaneers, your freelance illegal pirates. But in general, there was a very real risk that if you sent a ship out, it might not come home. And when the expense is at large, losing a ship could totally ruin a merchant. Now, there were still merchants who owned their own ships, but this was enough of a problem that there was a widespread desire to do something about it. And this would lead directly to the creation of the Joint Stock Business Corporation. Then, later on in the Industrial Revolution, once producers started to produce using more expensive and complicated industrial facilities, once they started investing in very expensive machines, in very large plants, having to build dedicated buildings where the machinery is built into the building, and you can only operate at a certain scale. If you remember my story about me working on the assembly line from the competition lecture, think that, right? We can only use the machinery if we have enough of it, if we have a big enough facility. Well, you start to get to a point where manufacturing, something that had always been a very sole proprietorship enterprise, a very individualistic, the craftsman lives in his house, works in his house, and he makes tools on his own type deal, starts to become mechanized, but that mechanization demands resources that are greater than the ability of any individual to summon up on their own. Manufacturing gets pushed from being proprietorship focused to being partnership focused, and eventually it starts to push up against the very boundaries of what's possible within a proprietorship. See, technological change was making our mode of production so complicated that we needed new legal concepts to resolve some of the complication, to cut through some of that clutter and make it manageable once again. Now, what emerged was the concept of a corporation. And the basic idea of a corporation, 3 words that sum up what it's all about, is fictional legal person. Fictional legal person. A person like you or I who exists in the law, but who does not exist in reality. Make believe. Why would we have this? Why would we introduce an aspect of make believe into our legal code? Well, think. Law exists to regulate interactions between people. It's meaningless otherwise. You can't meaningfully, I meant to say, you can't meaningfully have law that governs the animals or the plants or the forces of nature. The whole premise of law is that it's a conflict resolution mechanism. It's a way of trying to keep us from killing and clubbing each other. And at its most basic unit has to be the individual, an individual, rational, moral agent, something that has the ability to think, that has the ability to communicate, and thus, by extension, to trade and compromise with other people. And what the corporation does is it plays a magic trick. It says, what we'll do is we'll take a group of people and we'll treat the group of people as if it were a person in and of itself. And this means that corporations are going to have what's called legal personality. Only a person can own property. Only a person can sue and be sued. Only a person can have contracts with other people. Because only a person is a rational agent that's capable of understanding and acting upon such a concept. But we're going to allow a corporation to do that, because a group of people is capable of delegating authority to someone to act on their behalf. So the corporation is going to be able to own property, sue and be sued, have contracts with other people and corporations. And this is going to give investors what's called limited liability, in contrast to the unlimited liability of the sole proprietorship. See, the corporation can lose property, such as when it undergoes bankruptcy, when it loses a lawsuit, but the investor cannot. The investor can lose no more than what they put into the corporation. If your corporation that you've invested in goes bankrupt, well, the banks or the government or whoever it is that's claiming this, right? They can go and take the corporation's money. They can go and take the corporation's property, but they can't go to you, the shareholder, and take your house and your car, because your property is separate from the corporation's property. It's a kind of wonky idea to introduce at first, but are you getting the significance of this? What's meant by a person? The corporation has been set up in the likeness of a person. It's not a real person, but we all agree to treat it as though it is, so that we can mentally separate the acts of the corporation and, by extension, the consequences of its acts from the people who invest. One thing I want to emphasize, this does not mean that you can't go to jail for violating the law on behalf of the corporation. That can still happen. But a shareholder who had nothing to do with violating the law, they can't. If your CEO is telling people to dump toxic sludge into, like a public swimming pool, they're going to go to prison. But someone who just happened to buy a stock that day, planning to sell it the next day, they can't go to prison because the corporation violated the law. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to resolve the risk aspect of large groups of people working together. You're still going to have regulations that govern what a corporation can do. You can still hold employees of the corporation or directors of it responsible for things that they choose to do that are illegal. But nobody has to worry when they buy stock in Microsoft that they're going to lose everything if Microsoft goes bankrupt tomorrow. And this is also why corporations are going to have to pay corporate tax. Individuals have to pay income tax, right? And you'll also have to pay income tax on any dividends you receive from a corporation that you're invested in. But the corporation as a person also pays its own tax too. And this is a trade-off. It's a trade-off, firstly, for the businessman who chooses whether or not to incorporate. They get limited liability, which is nice, but they have to pay higher taxes, which isn't. It's also a payment for the privilege of everyone playing make-believe. Oh, yes, you are totally a real person, so pay up. Now, corporations grew out of Roman concepts of republican government. The Romans had a problem. It wasn't unique to them. There were actually quite a few Republican and Democratic governments in the ancient world. I don't know how the other ones resolved it, but I know how the Romans resolved it. We have an issue. Unlike all of the monarchies that exist around us, our leader changes like really frequently. I think in the case of Rome, I think they actually elected a new consul every single year. Our leader is always changing, and the new leader isn't usually the child, the heir of the old leader. So, how do we separate the property, the obligations, the liabilities of the leader from the people as a whole? See, in a monarchy, this isn't really a problem because most of the time, the heir of the monarch, in a personal sense, is also their heir in, the government sense. There's a continuity. The government itself is kind of like the personal property of the monarch. But in a republic, that's not true. It wouldn't make sense that if Caesar gets voted out one year, that he should have to pay off the whole national debt. But likewise, Caesar should not be able to dip his hand into the treasury and use it to buy, fancy togas for his wife. Well, this is where the corporation emerges, because the way the Romans, an incredibly legalistic people, dealt with this was they reasoned when a group of people, a body or corpus of people, get together for some kind of common cause, that group, that collective, adds up to something greater than the sum of its parts, and it adds up to something with its own identity in almost a metaphysical sense. So in Romans, now in their day, they don't really have business corporations yet, but they're going to use this corporation concept in their own government. They're going to use it in their religious institutions. And this holds true even in modern society. See, most of you, I'd wager, only ever think of corporations as being for-profit businesses. But there are a lot of things in our world that are technically corporations. We just don't tend to call them that. Like, say, city governments, state governments, the federal government. Can you sue the city of Clemson? Of course you can. Can you sue the federal government? Of course you can. Anytime you hear about one of these famous Supreme Court cases where it's so-and-so versus the United States, that's what they're doing. Sometimes, every now and then in this class, you'll hear me go off about conspiracy land. Out in conspiracy land, there's a lot of goofballs who, one way or another, they run across the idea that the United States government is a corporation. And then they conclude, because they've been reared on Hollywood movies where capitalism is always bad. Yeah, right? Capitalism's evil, rich man bad. Well, then they think that If the US is a corporation, that means it must be a for-profit business corporation, and it must also be evil, secretly evil. And usually these numbnuts will then go on to tell you about how, like, you can get out of a speeding ticket if you start to rant to the cop about maritime law and how you're a sovereign Moorish citizen. And then they kick your ass, and everyone laughs, especially me. I don't have problems with cops because I'm always real polite to them. Um, that's your random rant for today. Well, yeah, government institutions are corporations. Here's another one that they complain about in conspiracy land. Did you know that the Roman Catholic Church is a corporation? Did you know that the Church of Latter-day Saints is run by a corporation? Yeah, so's the Salvation Army and the American Bible Society. What's your point, dumbass? Clemson University is a corporation. Universities are another one. There are tons of corporations in our world that have nothing to do with business. But the reason why they exist, the reason why we have this idea that a company can be a person is to make this sort of collective action possible. People that don't understand this, they tend to find it offensive in some way. They feel like there's some kind of scam job behind this notion that that a company can have rights like a person. But the whole reason that they have these rights is to facilitate the kind of mass action that would be impossible if they didn't. And this is true regardless of what you're doing it for. I'll tell you right now, if you don't have corporations, you don't have the Industrial Revolution. Some of the earliest factories were run as sole proprietorships, but that did not last for real long. You don't get the modern world without corporations, but you also don't get stuff like this. Corporate law is magic. It's part of the secret sauce of how the Western world took off. I really wish I was teaching you secret history of the corporation. It's fun, but you don't get colonization without corporate charters for colonies. You don't get, well, I already said the modern world. You don't have a basis for a Republican form of government without the concept of legal personhood. It's just a way of organizing people, whether it's for, you know, for good or for bad. I mean, Enron, maybe you've heard of them.